Hello YouTubers! Today we talk about patriarchy, everyone's favourite topic. This is a response video, and the video I'm responding to was made by Dr Kristi Winters. Its title is My Patriarchy Video, Anti-Feminist Comments. I will link to the video below. Let's begin.
Another thing that characterizes some of the comments on the patriarchy videos is whining about the definition of patriarchy I use. Now, the reason why these people are whining about the definition is because in the videos where I present evidence that men overwhelmingly hold power, the definition of patriarchy fits. So rather than actually admitting that the empirical world is best described by the concept of patriarchy when it comes to political power, economic power, social power, they want to argue that my definition is somehow not valid. So the one thing that they'll do is they'll just say your definition of patriarchy is wrong, but then not provide a sourced, external, credible definition that is appropriate for the social world, that shows that my data somehow would match that definition. And they also just make up bullshit definitions on the fly that have no basis in reality.
Definition. That actually would be a good place to start. Now, it's not invalid to challenge definitions in debate, particularly if the definition doesn't appear to match those in common use, or when the definition lacks clarity or seems to have been extended in some way. It is true that your example definition is a dictionary definition. Unfortunately, as it stands, it leans towards persuasion rather than simple description. Accepting such a definition commits us to the acceptance of a theory of which it's an integral part. You will have to forgive those of us who might be less than enthusiastic in agreeing to its veracity. In my view, definitions such as this, which contain persuasive terms, or terms that entail an acceptance of a theoretical position, have no legitimate use in this context.
If you want to raise a serious objection about my definition of patriarchy, then you need to get a definition that's not made up out of your ass. You have to actually do work and type words in Google and then read the results and think about them.
Good advice. Let's do that. Let's see if we can arrive at some definition that is precise, has clarity, and is adequate in describing patriarchies. Perhaps a more satisfactory definition is this. Is its brevity pleasing? Does it have necessary clarity? But most importantly, is it sufficient to describe patriarchies in the real world? Well, it would be adequate in defining this as a patriarchy, and this as a patriarchy. And just for gender balance, the definition of matriarchy is sufficient in describing this.
You know, if you go to a conference, if you're a real academic and you go to a conference and somebody presents their work, you have to engage with the work that they have brought to the table. You have to talk about the definitions they're using, and if you want to bring in some other ones, then you have to be able to give sources. If you want to talk about the data quality or alternative sources of data, then you have to do that in the context of their talk.
I think this is a part where we talk about methodology and conclusions. Firstly, let's set aside the data. It is what it is. I suspect that in this discussion, it is the one variable that can change radically with little significant impact on your thesis. Yet you refer exclusively to the United States system in your videos. The reason offered to the viewer for this focus was that this was easier for you, but one cannot help but wonder, given the numerous papers you have written in relation to the United Kingdom politics, why you did not feel able to bring to mind facts relevant to this debate from the primary area of study that you publish papers on. Now, an uncharitable interpretation, given the circumstances, is that this selection of the US over the UK is because the US is a better fit in relation to your thesis than that of the UK. I'm not familiar with US politics, at least not familiar enough to offer more than generalised comments, but I am conversant with UK politics, so I will use the United Kingdom context to examine the claims and conclusions contained in your video. Firstly, let's dispose of the null hypothesis. I'm sure many viewers found its use somewhat confusing, although it does sound rather scientific. But its use is, as I'm sure you're aware, somewhat controversial. I have to make the observation here that I find it remarkable that the social science disciplines appear to have concluded such a methodology in some way infers scientific objectivity. In my view, it almost certainly does not. For example, have you considered the possibility that both H0 and H1 are false? In simple terms, both the null and the alternative could both be untrue. Also, there is an issue that at least in the social sciences, the null is almost literally false, the implication of which should not be ignored. It is likely to lead to an affirmative result even if the researcher's substantive hypothesis is in fact false. In other words, we have an issue of simple bias, and this bias is built into the methodology rather than excluded by it. We need to ask the question, is it possible to construct a null hypothesis in an unbiased fashion, particularly in this instance, where you're cognizant of the data on which it rests? Another observation one might make in relation to the null hypothesis is this. The probability of the data given the hypothesis is not the same as the probability of the hypothesis given the data. I know this sounds a bit confusing, but for example, the probability of a Member of Parliament being a woman is not the same as the probability of a woman being a Member of Parliament. But this is the exact form given by the null hypothesis, and it is a serious flaw. The data itself is not contested, nor do I assert that patriarchies do not exist. The issue is the hypothesis, conclusion, and the methodology. It is unclear from watching your videos whether you have formally considered any alternatives, or controlled for hidden variables, or considered alternative explanations that might falsify your hypothesis. All such reasoning appears absent. Patriarchy is about power. You will find as many women in a patriarchy as men in a matriarchy. You would have found no token blacks in the government of apartheid South Africa, nor will you find a woman holding office in the Vatican. Such things are self-evident. It seems to me there is something eccentric represented here. To address what it is, I will have to touch on the concept of political egalitarianism, which in itself is a complex form of egalitarianism. What is displayed in the centre of the graphic appears to me to be a presentation of equal representation, which I do not consider to be political egalitarianism. Political egalitarianism is the idea that everyone has an equal worth when participating in a democratic process. This is not the same as the right to equal representation. The vote, for instance, is a non-transferable right. In an egalitarian system, each vote is of equal worth. Representation, on the other hand, can only be partial in a democracy. If we accept as true the hypothesis, the question is, at what percentage of representation does this chamber cease to be a patriarchy? Is it 10%, 20%, or 50%? If the percentage required is 50% representation, then the good doctor appears to have manufactured a paradox, because if all that is required is an equal representation in the chamber to evaporate the patriarchy, then that implies that each member of the chamber is of equal worth. It would also be true that each member would have been of equal worth even at lower percentages of representation. It seems to me that the issue is one of representation rather than some nebulous concept which we have labelled as patriarchy. After all, if men hold the power, then the actual percentages are somewhat irrelevant. It is only when each member is considered equal do the percentages become significant. Which begs the question, where is the entity described as patriarchy located? If not the chamber, and we seem to have established that that can't be the case, then the patriarchy must reside in the government. But we can ask the same question. How many ministers in the government need be female before patriarchy evaporates? What about higher offices? The Prime Minister's office, perhaps? Or the First Minister's office? No? Well, what about this? This individual is the highest authority in the realm. The government, parliament, judiciary, the army are all subservient to this single woman. This makes the argument appear rather weak at best.